Everyone's happy, perhaps we can get going. All right. A warm welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for making it and for making our vision, which I think emerged 3 months back, a reality to really get the conversation around industrial ecology with a focus on islands, especially the Pacific Island nations, going. And thanks so much for, despite your various busy commitments and schedules to make it today, to add to our knowledge base on this very interesting area of work. To give you a quick background about our islands section as well, I just wanted to give you a brief introduction around what this new section of the International Society of Industrial Ecology really entails, and where we are sort of situated within the large spectrum of things. So I'll just quickly screen share. Uh, so our session today, of course, has the theme of resilience and resource sufficiency in the Pacific Islands as the focal point of our discussion. And I already introduced our team. So we have Dominic, who's based at Boku University in Austria, and we have Aishwarya, who's based at Yale University in the US. So we've had plenty of interesting, I think, cross-collaborative time zone discussions to reach here today. And so thanks to both of you as well. Um, so a quick snapshot of what we can expect today. We'll have a quick introduction around our section and also the theme and how we arrived really at it. We will then move forward with the panelist presentations. In terms of introductions, I may introduce the panelists and get them to present and then go on with that. I think that may just make it easier for the audience to digest the various diverse backgrounds and sort of connections that can be built through this session as well. And then, of course, we'll have time for question and answers from the audience, as well as the rest of us who are here. And then, yes, time permitting, and depending on the response and people who may be able to make it live, we do have a section where we may sort of encourage informal networking among the attendees just to get the community sort of more familiar with each other's work. And so, yeah, that's sort of the simple plan for today. So what is the island industrial ecology section all about? So essentially, that's just a little bit of a photo from our first board meeting. If I'm not wrong, it happened early this year. And so, yes, we do reflect quite a global community in that regard. But our section was established in September 2020, known as the Island Industrial Ecology, and it is now one of the 7 sections of the Society of Industrial Ecology. We currently have around 77 members, and the membership is growing within the section. Overall, the society has around 500 members across universities and practitioners across the globe. And so why we thought it was an important section to address on its own was essentially because islands are sites of compound events and multiple risks, as I think most of us can appreciate. They're also highly vulnerable to the impacts of global warming, such as sea level rise, flooding, droughts, hurricanes, and practices such as infrastructure development along the coast, high imports, undiversified exports, poor waste management, and centralized energy systems have added additional stress to the resources in these islands. And at the same time, they also are excellent systems for industrial ecology scholarship and offer a rare opportunity for sustainability research and transformation. With relatively well-defined boundaries, naturally and socially, they can be the real-world laboratories, we believe, and an approach that is gaining momentum in addressing societal challenges. So our section essentially helps promote basic and policy relevant industrial ecology research to foster transformation to sustainability. And we encourage combining transdisciplinary approaches to engage stakeholders for more inclusive resource use patterns on islands. We have a variety of backgrounds, I would say, within the section. We work in areas around resource self-sufficiency, food and energy security, sustainable water and nutrient management, waste management, infrastructure, equitable distribution of costs and benefits. And lastly, our theme is sort of a reflection of some of these dichotomies that we have observed in our understanding of how these islands and industrial ecology in islands develop. So it is, of course, looking at resilience and resource self-sufficiently in the Pacific Islands is what we will be discussing today. And that is almost a means of furthering some of our sort of interests in growing the readership and contribution of research on islands. And this is, I think, one of our first events from the section. So a big thank you and hearty congratulations to all of you to make it a possibility. And we would like to welcome our very eminent panelists today who bring a wealth of knowledge and experience on various facets when it comes to islands, as well as looking at topics of resilience and self-sufficiency. In addition to being able to offer practical knowledge on furthering sustainable development in island nations. So, warm welcome to all of you, and thank you so much. We may now begin with the presentation. So like I mentioned, I will introduce the panelists before we request them to present, and then we can go on pretty much in that format. So it's more relatable. And to begin with, I'll request Ms. Anna Guerrero to perhaps get set up. I can stop my screen share perhaps. And Anna, while you're sort of setting up the screen share, a quick background. So Anna is a research principal at the Institute for Sustainable Futures in the University of Technology, Sydney, which is also where I am based. And Anna is a resilience, climate change, and disaster risk leader and specialist with over 13 years of experience in the Asia Pacific region. She is an experienced project manager, having led climate change and disaster resilience consultancies, evaluations, and research projects since 2008 across 10 Pacific Island countries. We are very lucky to have you, Anna. Thank you. With experience working with DFAT, MFAT, the Pacific Community, UNDP, and a host of other trans-Pacific organizations, Anna has an applied understanding of a range of ways in which climate change and disasters influence development. Anna's background in climate science underpins her experience working on projects with climate change and disaster implications relevant to humanitarian response, urbanization, informal settlements, water, sanitation, and hygiene, gender, aid effectiveness, forced migration, and human mobility. She has published numerous research and evaluation outputs, including academic journal papers, research project reports, working papers, evaluation reports, and policy briefs. So welcome, Anna, and over to you.
Thank you, Simran. Thank you for that. And it's a real pleasure and privilege to speak with you all today. Industrial ecology is not my background, and so yeah, it's a really wonderful opportunity, you know, to work, you know, collaboratively and to share my experience and to see where the connections lie, because we all know in this world there's a number of different ways we can collaborate and connect. So yeah, thank you very much for having me. I'll just get straight into my presentation after that introduction from Simran. So I just wanted to share, you know, my key messages up front. If there's anything I want you to remember from my presentation, it's these three things. So first of all, around framing, I think it's really important to think about how we frame the Pacific and the Pacific Islands, and recognize it's not just the land, it's also the oceans. So the oceans are recognised by Pacific Islanders as their lifeblood and a source of sustainable development. So I think this framing really resonates with me because it comes from a really strengths-based approach as opposed to focusing on gaps and vulnerabilities. The second point I wanted to make, and I'm sure everyone's aware, but just climate change is a real and immediate threat, and it's a here and now development issue in the Pacific, but that communities, governments, regional organisations are already embedding climate change considerations into policies, programs and activities on the ground, and I'll share some of those with you. Lastly, thinking about resilience. Resilience to climate change can be considered in a number of ways. I'm sure we're all aware of that. Resilience is quite a big buzzword at the moment. My research that I've done, we've developed a socio-ecological framework that supports understanding community resilience and different experiences of resilience at the community level. So I'll provide a couple of examples of what that looks like. So first of all, this map, the Pacific is included in a group of nations, as we're all aware, small island developing states, SIDS. And this framing, it really focuses on the smallness of the land, the remoteness, and indeed the vulnerability of these islands. And you can see on this very simple, somewhat blurry map, a lot of the Pacific countries, you can't even really see them. They're hard to make out amongst the blue of the ocean. So it's really the ocean that kind of dominates in this picture. Now, recently, SIDS representatives put forth a proposal to the UN to rename themselves such that the significance of the ocean is prioritised over that of the land. So instead of SIDS, they coined this phrase, large ocean developing states, or LODs, as an alternative to SIDS. I think it's kind of funny to note that this was their second proposed idea. Their first acronym, the first phrase was the Great Ocean Developing States, but the acronym of GODS was not going down so well. It was perhaps a bit presumptuous. So LODS was put forth. So although I'm laughing, I think this shifting of language is really important. And it harks back to a very influential essay written in 1993 by a really important anthropologist and writer, Epeli Hau'ofa, called Our Sea of Islands. And I'm sure some of you on this call today hopefully will know of that, because it's a really important piece that does just that. It shifts the thinking around what we see when we look at this map and what we think about when we think about the Pacific Ocean and Pacific Islands. So Hau'ofa wrote that rather than the sea separating the islands, it connected the islands. So it's that changing narrative. Instead of being sea-locked peoples marooned on coral or volcanic tips of land, Hau'ofa wrote that islanders formed an oceanic community based on voyaging. So he argued that the term Oceania is a better representation of the Pacific Islands, as thinking about the oceans as the lifeblood and as a source of sustainable development. So this framing is more focused around strengths, the strengths of the ocean. It prioritizes the value and resources and resourcefulness of the people and environment of Oceania. These qualities are definitely alive and well in the Pacific. Traditional knowledge is a critical element to adaptation and pathways to resilience going forward. So our research at ISF really tries to take this on, this strengths-based approach, even when thinking about climate change, which we know is an existential threat to some of these minute dots that you can't really even see on the screen. So that's just a starting point I wanted to kick us off with. Next, the next key message is around climate change impacts. Like I said at the start, it's a here and now issue. And I just wanted to convey that although it is already happening, there are actions to overcome it. But just to share from our research, what we are seeing in terms of on the ground impacts of climate change. So on the left, this is a cane field in Fiji. Sugarcane is a huge income earner for people in Fiji. But sea level rise, saltwater intrusion into the coastal cane farms is a contributing factor to sugarcane farmers diversifying out of sugarcane, coupled with external factors that are also making sugarcane less profitable. In Kiribati, we've seen that sea level rise leads to brackish water and coastal erosion, and together with increasing temperatures and rainfall shortages, it's affecting the quality and quantity of drinking water and also the ability to grow food. In Vanuatu, we found that changing weather patterns, including stronger winds, we know that people on small islands rely on their own boats to get from their small islands to the mainland, when the wind is too strong, they're unable to paddle their canoes across, and so they can't get their kids to school, which are often on the mainland. And lastly, in Tonga, we've seen that unpredictable seasons and reduced rainfall leads to less productive agricultural yields. Farmers are less able to rely on their traditional knowledge that they have done for many hundreds and thousands of years to grow their own food. We heard from youth research participants that they're not able to rely on rainfall anymore for their drinking water. They actually need to purchase water. So these are examples that show that to become resilient to these changes, communities really need to adapt and transform their normal ways of working and living. I'm just going to skip that because I'm just conscious of the time, but I just wanted to focus on not just the gaps and the weaknesses that I've said there, but also there is a lot going on in terms of the policy context and strategies that are embedding climate change into regional responses. So on this slide, you can see a number of regional policies that all take climate change really seriously. So these are regional policies and strategies that are ensuring that climate change is embedded into steps moving forward. Now, we've done quite a lot of work on looking at climate change and resilience in the Pacific. So I just wanted to share how we actually frame that. What do we mean when we talk about resilience? What does it look like? So we developed a research framework based on a DFID model. So this is the sort of the full framework that is based on DFID, but we've contextualized it to the Pacific context. I want to focus on this part over here. These are elements that we see as being core to a resilient community in the Pacific. So I'll just skip forward to the next slide, which shows it in a slightly more digestible form. So this slide presents those 5 elements or attributes of community resilience. This is grounded in a socio-ecological definition, considering both the environment and the social and economic factors that contribute to resilience. So what are these factors? We think a resilient community has these factors that are action. So a resilient community is evolving, it's dynamic, it's undergoing transformative change in responses to disturbances like climate change and disasters, whilst also retaining core elements of that community's identity. A resilient community has inclusive and robust leadership and governance structures. A resilient community combines local and external knowledge. A resilient community incorporates a willingness to adapt and to accept change and respond. And in terms of the people and environment linkage, a resilient community acts in balance within its biophysical limits to support thriving communities. So I'll just leave that with you just for a moment. What I'm going to do now is provide a couple of examples from our research that demonstrates some of these elements, particularly the action element. So what a resilient community looks like from our perspective in our research in terms of action. So what does resilience to climate change and disasters look like? So my 2 examples, firstly, thinking about energy. So like I said, the first example relates to action. So we see this community as demonstrating resilience in terms of the way it has adapted in terms of energy. Our research explored a donor-funded project in Tonga. So this is Tonga. On the left, you can see the poles and wires that have been climate-proofed. The local energy company called TPL, Tonga Power Limited, received funding through ADB and Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, as well as a couple of other donors to strengthen and make more resilient those poles and wires, including the transmission lines. Not all of them have been done in this picture, but from the main line here to the house, a lot of them have been put underground such that when a tropical cyclone comes through, those lines remain safe from those strong winds. If the pole tips over, then the line is underground. So it's called the Outer Islands Renewable Energy Project. And like I said, it was an upgrade to the electricity network to make it more climate resilient. Another piece to the same project was to do small solar installations. You can see the research team in front of the solar installation there. And so this was both, you could say it was both an adaptation and a mitigation approach, in that emissions are obviously reduced through the solar component, and adaptation through the climate resilient infrastructure. So we know that many countries are aiming to reduce emissions through renewable energy, and this example shows that it aims to reduce its dependence on imported diesel, which is the main source of fuel for the production of power for people in Tonga. So adaptation and mitigation are obviously both needed, and they often carry co-benefits, as in this case in Tonga. The second example I wanted to show is around economic resilience, so quite a different take. And what you can see here is women in Vanuatu, in Wala Island, which is in Malumpa province, just to the north of where Port Vila, the capital, is. The woman on the right here has a vision impairment, but she's still very much capable to do the traditional weaving. And this, again, is a donor-funded project through the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Australia to support women to change their traditional weaving practice to an income-generating activity, which enabled them to put savings in the bank. It really shifted the gender dynamics in the household, such that the husbands, it's quite a patriarchal society, where the men are usually the decision makers and controllers of the finances, but women's capability to create an income through this traditionally women-centered activity enabled them to open bank accounts and to save money for other productive purposes, like baking bread to sell, or to do some sewing to often to sell as well. So they're able to save money, and like I said, it really changed the gender dynamics and made them more economic resilient, such that when a cyclone did come through, they had the capacity to bounce back quicker and to think about spending their own money from their savings on rebuilding their homes as well. So back to my 3 takeaways, because I got the 2-minute warning. Our work tries to frame the Pacific around the oceans, and to really acknowledge that the way we think about the Pacific and the way we think about small island developing states, it really has an impact on everything, and on the power imbalance as well between outsiders compared to the people that live in these regions. So we try and take that strengths-based approach and consider the oceans and Oceania as opposed to Pacific Islands, and focusing on the small land surrounded by the big islands. Also acknowledging that climate change is definitely a here and now development issue, but there is a lot happening in the Pacific, and our research really tries to align with and partner with regional organisations, as well as NGOs and governments, to try and work in partnership to solve and to work towards resilient transformations. And our experiences of resilience, we like to explore it through our framework, which includes a socio-ecological framing, acknowledging the people and the environment connections, and that provide a really great basis to explore what resilience means at the community level. So I will leave it there. Thank you very much. I'm really keen to participate in panel discussions and Q&A after. But thanks a lot.
Thanks so much, Anna. That was wonderful. And of course, I think brings up a lot of questions which we may touch upon later, as perhaps oceans being the lifeblood, and also drawing on, the examples around economic resilience, I think, that you spoke about, really tie in well with economic empowerment and sort of driving ground up change towards development. So look forward to picking on some of those threads later on. Thanks, Anna. Our next panelist, Dr. Rui Jing, he is a research associate at the School of Engineering in Cardiff University. And Dr. Rui's research focuses on multi-energy system modeling, urban energy transitions, climate resilience and climate-resilient energy systems, as well as energy-related nexus research. And I think he has some interesting examples to showcase for us today as well. So far, he has had more than 30 journal publications and was recognized for several Best Paper Awards and Outstanding Reviewer Awards. He is also active in research and consulting for companies and government. Like I mentioned earlier, his research interests center around energy system modeling, climate resilient energy planning. And so a warm welcome to you, Rui. I'll stop my screen share so you can get all set up.
Okay, let me see. Can you see my sharing?
Yes.
Okay. Hi guys, it's a great honor to share our recent research on the Nexus approach towards sustainable energy and food self-sufficiency for islands. So here is today's agenda from 4 aspects. Firstly, let's look at the background. As we know, traditionally, energy and food are considered as land competing issues. But now we have the nexus approach to see the interconnections between the energy and the food projects development. And we have like co-locating the PV panels with the fishing, and we could also co-locate the PV panels with the agriculture, and all this nexus approach achieve mutual benefits such as efficient land use, it cool down the surface and provide necessary shadings for the fish pond or for the agriculture facilities, and it also double the income for the local residents, and also it achieve efficient water use. So starting from 2019, lots of publications on top journals start to look at this nexus, and several tools could help to further develop this nexus system, such as modeling and optimization tools, and also the biogeochemical based simulation for the cropping, and also some GIS based tools for the potential assessment. And I will give some examples at the following. The first example is an island energy system design case, and the island is located in the Daguang Island in the China's Yellow Sea. And as you can see here, we design and planning an energy system with PV panels, wind turbines, biodiesel generator, wave power generation, and also the batteries. And it also provides 5 ton fresh water per day, driven by the renewables. And it achieves a quite good energy and water access here. Although it's just a demonstration site, but it also provides lots of information, useful information for further develop other island energy systems. The second example is that we develop an optimization-based decision support tool to see whether we should choose food or choose energy on the rooftop of the buildings. So we model different rooftop utilization solutions, such as installing PV panels. And we also consider 3 kinds of agriculture options, such as roof farming, open farming, and the unconditioned greenhouse, and also the conditioned greenhouse. And we put all this all the options. We simulate the capex, the OPEX, the yield, and the emissions by the DNDC based biogeochemical simulation tools, and then we feed all the information into an optimization model with the energy system together, and we can achieve an optimal overall system design. And then here is a case study in Shanghai, and we have a business zone with 30 buildings, and we firstly clustered into 6 small zones, and each zone is allowed to build its own system and make its own decisions to which kind of option they would like to use on the rooftop. And we further simulate the tomato growth by the DNDC simulation tool. And we feed all this information into an optimization model that we developed. So we can get the information that installing PV panels could save more money, and implementing a roof agriculture may reduce more emissions. And if we enable the rooftop agriculture options other than just the energy options, it increase the design flexibility for the whole system. And based on that, we further develop a roof farming database that include 10 kinds of vegetable and different kinds of planting ways. And then we collect all the information and feed into the whole system model. It is noteworthy that the optimal results may vary with the different kinds of cases, but the model itself is quite applicable for different kind of cases. So the next case is about co-locating the PV panels with vegetation. And with proper designs here, we could achieve the double income from the PV generation and also the farming, and it will not affect the plant growth too much. And we have a partnership test field, and they have proven that this kind of nexus by co-locating the PV panels with vegetation in greenhouse, it's technically and also economically feasible. And it takes 40 days for the vegetable to be ready for each for each crop. And here are some tips for the island maybe. The first one is that it could provide the local fresh food, and since planting of vegetables require lots of fresh water, so maybe the rainwater from the island need to be reused and collected and reused. And such kind of co-locating technology is both good for the open farm or greenhouse, and it could reduce the whole supply chain emissions. And we still need to be cautious because we need to consult the local biologist to see if it's any like ecosystem issues to develop such kind of nexus system. So as the last page, it's a quick summary here that we can offer the system modeling and design optimization tools. And we also have the GIS-based potential assessment tools, and we can perform the social economical impact studies. And we also have experimental test fields. And here are some challenges maybe worth a discussion. One of them is that for lots of companies, for lots of nations, the policy feasibility for this kind of multi-use of the agricultural land is still not allowed. So it's a quite a challenging. And the second challenging is that maybe island countries or cities are facing more uncertain weather, and maybe the extreme weather risks it's worth investigation. And also planting things require lots of water supply, so it's also a issue there. And at last, there are several other energy technologies that may be applicable for the island. One is the floating PV, that we float the PV panels on the surface of the ocean. And another one is the OTEC, the ocean thermal energy conversion. It basically utilizes the temperature difference between the surface of the sea and the bottom of the sea to generate the power. So this is another alternatives for islands. Okay, that's the end of my slides. And if you are interested in our research, please feel free to contact me. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dr. Jing. Really appreciate the kinds of approaches that you shared based on your research. I am aware that your project so far hasn't looked at specifically in the Pacific Islands, but I think there would be sort of interlinkages to draw upon what Anna was reflecting in terms of the on ground realities, and how maybe there might be possibilities to expand on food energy nexus system. So thanks so much
Yes,
for
agree. Yes, thank you.
thanks. All right. So our next panelist is Dr. Amardeep Bonda. Thanks so much, Amardeep, for making it. Amardeep is a project director at the Asia Pacific Waste Consultants, and she's APWC's International Waste Management and Marine Litter expert, has extensive experience providing waste management and policy analysis to provide practical solutions for waste management challenges and control of land and marine sources of plastic litter into the marine environment. Amardeep has more than 12 years of experience working with academia, local government, and international aid organizations across Australia, the Pacific, the Caribbean, Central America, Africa, and Asia. Amardeep leads APWC's practice and has extensive experience in waste data project management, waste auditing, recycling, technical reporting, and evidence-based policy. Her strengths include strategy and program planning, stakeholder engagement, community consultation, and delivering projects on time and within budget. A wealth of, I think, on-ground implementation experience is what I think we would like to draw upon from Amardeep's presentation as well. And most recently, Amardeep developed a methodology that supports a common approach for comprehensive data collection, endorsed and adopted by the Pacific Regional Infrastructure Facility and its members. So thanks so much, and welcome to you, Amardeep.
Thank you, Simran. And thank you indeed for the invitation to present today at the, it's really a privilege, and to talk about waste management. I often get too excited about rubbish. So if I do seem to be getting too excited, please stop me. I'm always happy to stop going on a tangent. So just to start about APWC, I run a small consulting company. We have about 18 staff. We specialize in waste management, recycling, and marine litter. We have worked in all Pacific Island countries. I currently have staff in 9 countries, including six Pacific Island countries. My staff speak 15 languages. We are proudly female-owned with more than 70% women, and we support women coming back into the workforce after having children. We have presence in the Pacific, South Africa, Europe, Asia, and Australia. In the last 5 years, we've done a lot of work, specifically in the small island developing states in the Pacific, the Caribbean, Africa, Asia, and Central America. And the major clients that we've been working with include most of the multilateral aid agencies and direct work with DFAT, ANFAT, DEFRA, DFID, and all that. Our genesis is from an Australian company, which has been around for almost 24 years. And we decided to look outwards into the international development space about 5 years ago, which is when I came on board. So as Anna mentioned, and it is really amazing to hear when my experiences match with those who've also worked in the Pacific Islands. The islands have a small landmass, but they have a very large EEZ, or exclusive economic zone, which means they are very highly impacted by marine pollution. Often, a lot of this pollution is not generated by them, but comes to their shores, and they have to deal with it. Pacific is a net importer of materials. So from a waste management perspective, it is fascinating to hear all the new and amazing work that is being done in the climate change and renewable energy space. But one of the things that I would like to mention to the experts in this field is to please think about what would happen at the end of life to all these materials. Because one of the things that we are finding is that with a lot of focus having been on renewable energy and climate change in the last 2 decades, the landfills are now inundated with renewable energy waste. The Pacific Islands, even the major cities, are at a relative financial and geographical disadvantage. They are isolated, it's hard to get material in and out. The outer islands are extremely remote, and any waste management practices that happen there are purely traditional, but they don't know how to deal with the modern materials. There is limited land available for landfilling. Most of the Pacific Islands, and I've been to 10 of them, do not have the land to manage the waste that they generate. They have no infrastructure. When they do, they can't fix it, they can't operate it, they can't manage it. They have small and largely dispersed populations, which make for very small financial return and the basis for governments or local governments to have a financial base to provide services. They have an inability to reach a critical mass for economies of scale to be available to them for recycling. And they lack resources, financial, technical, and human. A lot of the funding, even from an international space, has been focused on other sectors. And I would like to temper it by saying that a lot of focus is on waste management in the last 4 or 5 years. So a lot of work is being done. I'm going to focus, divide the challenges up into economic, technological, and environmental, as well as regulatory. So in terms of economic challenges, the locations are all remote. They have no or low revenue base. There is no collection systems available in most Pacific Island countries. Where there are collection systems available, and when I say collection systems for waste, I mean for waste, they are only available in the major cities. In Vanuatu, it's Port Vila, only 30% of the main island of Ufate, because that's Port Vila, that's where tourists go. The rest of the country has no means. They have no bins, they have no bags, they can't put their rubbish anywhere. There is no incentive for recycling. In Australia, all of the states have container deposit systems. We have recycling bins, we have education programs in place. Nothing exists in the Pacific. Any recovery of material is almost always performed by waste pickers, who are a highly marginalized group, often women and children, with no support, no PPE, no facilities provided of any sort. And they are working in highly unhygienic conditions at the cost of their health. And this is pervasive all across the developing world, I must say. There is no ongoing financial support available for sorting or for processing infrastructure for that matter. And for the longest time, there has been a lack of prioritization of investment into waste and waste management. This has changed dramatically recently, especially in the countries of Tuvalu and Solomon Islands, who made great strides because of some recent support that has been provided to them. In terms of technological challenges, data is a huge issue. We don't know what exists, what doesn't exist. A lot of work has been done in the last 2 years on collecting consistent, comparable data so that appropriate systems can be put in place. I come back to land for landfilling because just having land doesn't mean you can have a landfill. It requires landfills are highly technical things. There is no money or tech available for these landfills to happen in the Pacific, in the medium term at least. No infrastructure available for sorting or reprocessing. There is no equipment available. Any equipment that they do have at the moment is secondhand equipment from some of the development partners, which means that its life is once again much shorter than it would originally be. A simple example is rubbish collection trucks. There is no Pacific Island that has access to new collection trucks. Most of them come from Japan, France, Australia. A lot of these trucks can't even access the places where the waste has to be collected from. On average, a rubbish truck should last between 10 to 25 years. The life cycle of a rubbish truck in the Pacific is about 2 to 5 years. And that means that at the end of its life, they have to deal with the truck itself and somehow find a way to recycle or replace it. There's a severe lack of technical skills. Often there is one officer who's responsible for looking after waste, education, implementation, compliance, legislation, policy, procurement of equipment, and coordinating all the donor activity in the space. So their ability to actually do much is very, very limited. And that comes down to also the lack of human resources as well. In the Pacific, there is an overarching Cleaner Pacific strategy 2025, very high level. Most of the countries have their own waste management strategies, which are again very high level, very generic, do not have targets. When they do have targets, there is no roadmap on how to achieve those targets or what resourcing is required for those targets to be achieved. There is no resourcing for enforcement. There is no resourcing for engagement with projects. Often projects come, are there for 6 months, do something, leave. An example that I'd like to share with everyone is in Solomon Islands, a river boom project was implemented, which was highly successful, stopped marine litter from upstream of the river to enter the marine environment. However, as soon as the project finished, there was no funding for any personnel to go and clean the boom. So within 2 weeks of the project finishing, the river boom was removed. It's sitting there. It's sitting in a highly corrosive Pacific environment. It probably won't be usable very, very soon. And all of the waste that it collected is going back into the ocean. There is a lack of sustainable financing mechanisms for long-term investment. They're very challenging regulatory frameworks. Some of them are quite old. Most of the environmental acts in most of the countries do not actually allow for implementation of new regulation, like container deposit legislation or a ban or a levy, which means often if any such legislation has to come into place, then there has to be an entire regulatory reform process that has to be undertaken before that can happen. It's not true for all countries, but a lot of them. There is also very patchy compliance with international multilateral agreements like the Basel and Vigani, which they have to follow in order to be able to transport the recyclables if they ever collect them to other countries. So a lot of them haven't signed up, are not signatories or haven't endorsed it at the national levels, which means that often if a project allows them to collect material, they can't move it to a market. Well, it's all not doom and gloom. I want to mention a few very successful projects. And once again, going back to what Anna said, community engagement is key. There are two highly successful, very recent community projects which provide great hope, but also demonstrate the desire for the community to clean up their environment. In Vanuatu, on World Environment Day, on the 5th of June this year, a couple of weeks ago, the big bottle cleanup happened, where people were offered 10 watu for the return of a PET bottle, a PVT beverage container. Their aim was to collect 1 million bottles over 2 weeks. They were able to collect 1 million bottles within 3 days. And this is also going back to the issue of there being an enormous amount of legacy waste that exists, which is there in the environment, being leaked and causing environmental harm. So if there is an incentive provided, the community is willing and ready to be a part of recycling initiatives. In Solomon Islands, there was a hoax in 2019 where there was a rumor that someone is offering money for return of bottles, which led to within 2 weeks of cleanup of all streets of Honiara and people trying to bring bottles to all sorts of locations. In the end, it was actually a hoax, but it really demonstrated the desire of the community to engage in a cleanup activity when there is a very, very small incentive of 1 cent for bottle of it, 1 cent. A lot of countries have identified the fact or are on top of the fact that a lot of the materials that are littered and are causing environmental harm are imported. So they are moving ahead with bans. Vanuatu has the most extensive single-use plastic ban in the Pacific, almost in the world, because it includes a ban on nappies. I have to mention, however, that a lot of these bans are on hold because of the lack of alternatives. So if there is anyone who knows about alternatives that are accessible, reasonable, and can actually be transported to the Pacific, please, I would like to know about them. Samoa has implemented a very interesting single-use plastic ban. And the interesting thing about Samoa is that they found that there was a higher levy on imported cardboard products as compared to plastic products. So they were able to get their business community on board, who were worried about the financial impacts of the ban because the alternatives are more expensive, by literally switching the levy. So they switched the levy from a cardboard or paper product to a plastic product. And the ban has been very well received since then by the community. The ban has also been on hold because of COVID, because they can't receive materials. Fiji has implemented a ban on single-use styrofoam products. However, they undertook this ban without looking at the availability of alternatives. The ban is in place, and the community is a little bit in disarray, but that also happens a lot in the Pacific, as we know. Thank you for the 2-minute warning. Palau has one of the most successful container deposit legislation in the world, with a return rate of between 85 to 97%, which is unheard of in the developing world, which again shows the impact of incentives. Tuvalu, through direct funding support from EDF 11, which is the European Development Fund, has the most extensive advanced recovery fee in place, where a import levy is placed on materials beyond single-use plastics like electronic goods, nappies, cars, and that levy is then used to look at end-of-life solutions for the countries. The same advanced recovery fee legislation is being looked at by Samoa, Nauru, Niue, Kiribati, Vanuatu, and Solomon Islands. We're working on it right now. I'm very proud to be working on this project, and in the hope that something positive can come out of it. There is also a lot of work being done on creating a regional recycling network, because none of the countries have enough material for them to be able to demand an appropriate price for their recyclable product in the market. Whereas if there is a potential to collect materials at a central place, which can then be offered it for a market price, it is highly desirable. That work will commence in August this year. And like I said, there is a lot of there's direct support that has been asked by Tuvalu and Solomon Islands, but I am not aware of any other country receiving a non-multilateral kind of direct support for waste management activities. As I kept mentioning, it's not been all smooth sailing. A lack of alternatives means that a lot of bans have been legislated but not implemented. Lack of infrastructure, licensing issues, inability to transport material means the 1 million bottles were collected in Vanuatu, but they're going to landfill. So they're not in the environment, but they are in landfill because they don't have a market for them. They can't move them. There is a lack of funding. Community initiatives often start and then end, and then there's no way for them to continue. There is a lack of human and technological resources available to most of the countries. And I will end here. Thank you very much for having me today and for allowing me to share some of my experiences working in the Pacific. And I look forward to your questions and discussion. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Amardeep. I think we've covered fair ground, having looked at socio-ecological approaches towards development, also looking at food energy nexus systems, getting a thorough understanding of, I think, the effectiveness of waste management policies to a great extent, and maybe even the on-ground challenges when it comes to implementation. Of course, owing a lot to the sort of weak socio-technical developmental support. And I think there's plenty for us to reflect towards the end of the discussion. But we do have one very important aspect which Dr. Anthony Chu will be speaking about, which is to do with the eco-industrial development and facets around that, which would be relevant to island nations. Before I introduce Professor Chu, Dominic, would you like to just give a note around what, around the questions and how participants may be able to do that?
Of course. So we changed our plans slightly, and we will not do breakout rooms at the end. So we will have a slightly bigger time frame for questions and answers. And I would encourage everybody who wants to ask a question, just either write them in the chat and I can read them out, or just write your name there and then go ahead and ask your question directly.
Yeah, I think we want to capitalize on having this small group, maybe have more of a closer interaction with the panelists. And we, in the audience, we also have Bob Paul, who has plenty of experience looking at these facets in the Caribbean. So perhaps we can draw on some of those insights towards our question and answer session. And here goes with introducing Dr. Anthony Chu, who is a university fellow and professor at the La Salle University in the Philippines, as well as a member of the United Nations International Resource Panel. Dr. Chu is a specialist in the field of industrial engineering, resource efficient and cleaner production, sustainable consumption and production, as well as eco-industrial development, with over 150 publications and several international professional accomplishments. In 2014, he jointly co-authored the UNEP GEO SIDS Outlook, the Global Environmental Outlook for Small Island Developing States. He has also served in the first year of the International Society of Industrial Ecology Nominating Committee way back in 2001, and later served 2 terms as secretary of the society, and of course is an esteemed member and guide when it comes to the direction in which the society is headed. He represented the Philippines government in various United Nations summits and is a member of the International Resource Panel, advisor of Elsevier Atlas Sustainability Awards, and a steering committee member of the Future Earth Can Network on Systems of Sustainable Consumption and Production. Currently, he is the founding editor-in-chief of the Elsevier Journal for Cleanup and Responsible Consumption. And just to add, to tip it off with all his accomplishments, Dr. Chu received the 2018 National Research Council of the Philippines Engineering Achievement Award, and in 2020 received the National Academy of Science and Technology Environmental Science Award Special Citation. So with that, we welcome you, Professor Chu.
Thank you, Simran, for over introducing me. I think you added a lot from my simple draft. Can I have the sharing function, because I re-entered the room? Yeah, I was disabled to share.
Can you try again now? Yeah.
No, it's okay. It's working. Okay. All right. And I have to move this one here, move it back. All right. Okay. A great afternoon to all colleagues in ISIE, and also hopefully the non-members will join us, will join the ISIE big family. Yeah, thank you to Simran for introducing me from the time I joined ISIE from the day one, which was back in 2001. We were preparing for the Rio +10 meeting that time in Johannesburg. And just imagine we have gone through Rio +20, and we have now moved already into the SDG era. So that was quite a number of decades ago. Simran suggested to me to talk about eco-industrial development, and this session is about island section. Yeah, I need to really apologize. I'm not very familiar with the island section, but thanks to your introduction at the very beginning, because as you said, this island section was created only in 2020 in ISIE. So I got to know more about the island section, and I hope some of the materials I prepare here to share will be relevant. Okay. Well, first of all, the industrial ecology involvement of mine started back in 1990s, and about 10 years later in 2004, I edited the second special issue on industrial ecology for the Journal of Cleaner Production. And that time it was done in preparation with a late Ed Cohen Rosenthal, whom many youth may not know him. He started the Eco-Industrial Networking Initiative in United States, and he was based in Cornell University. And also that many of the early work of mine were well cited, and thanks to many researchers, this was published in the early 2004. Actually, it took us 3 years to prepare these special issues of 18 articles. So on the eco-industrial development, it covers several approaches, and eco-industrial park is only one of them. I will touch on that or scratch on the surface a little bit later. I will tell you more story about the scale and the 3+2 rule. I'm sure our colleague from Yale University is very familiar with this. And I'll tell you more story about the Gordon stories that we have gone through in the last 20 years or so. And the second part of my sharing will be more on the global GEO, the Global Environment Outlook for small island developing states. That was done in 5 days. We were called to Geneva on a Sunday, and we were basically under quarantine for 5 days from Monday, and we finished the book by Friday in 2014. I think around 15 of us gathered together, working almost like 12 hours in the UN Environment Head Office. So for consideration to this topic, or to the title I put earlier, I really do not understand what is the scope of the island section earlier. So I really look into some keywords. One is the island, or we are only talking about the small island. And when we talk about the small island or islands, they are developing states and they are developed economies. And finally, what's the role of EID in these places? So if you will look at the Pacific, we call the Asia Pacific more or less west of this map, and maybe the American Pacific to the right, but APEC covers everything. And if you look at from this Google map, you can see few islands or big islands. Actually, Australia, we call it a continent when I was much younger. And the other islands I could see from my naked eye are the Indonesia, Philippines, these are archipelago actually, Malaysia, Japan, the island of Taiwan, and maybe a peninsula of Korea. Down there is a New Zealand, of course, sorry for the screenshot. And a smaller one there I can see is Fiji Island. Okay, but if you talk about the seats in the Pacific, you can go bigger a little bit, zoom into it. You will see Solomon Island, New Caledonia, Vanuatu, and many others. And later on, you will see more, Tuvalu. And it's actually our two speakers earlier, lady speakers have already discussed many of the cases in details about these smaller islands. Also on the developing stages of these island and small islands, they really varies a lot. If you talk about, well, Singapore is part of the seat actually, but I don't really recall how developing it fits Singapore. So Singapore and Japan and the peninsula of Korea are already in the part of the OECD. So they really don't belong to the developing. And for the Southeast Asia, like Philippines, Malaysia, and Indonesia, which I had a recent publication using the energy analysis of the sustainability issues of these three island countries in Southeast Asia, they are relatively bigger. Actually, Indonesia is the second biggest next to many others. In terms of, they are archipelago in nature. So then if we move to the small islands in the Pacific, I think the development stages are a little bit behind these bigger masses. And there are, of course, reasons behind. And therefore, the EID approaches make it different. So let me start with the EID approaches. So I started working on the eco-industrial development area back in 1995. And more or less, I finished my work in 2005. After 2005, I started emerge into more SCP policies, etc., in my government and in my university. So at that time, we started working in Asia Pacific, as you can see the circle on the right, and we concluded with a big 90-member meeting on eco-industrial park development in the entire Asia Pacific, including Australia and Fiji Island, in a meeting in Manila in 2001. Then we moved on the same concept to share the experience with North Africa, Latin America, and also the North America, including Mexico. Mexico is part of North America. And that we concluded in 2004. That was in partnership working with Column Board people, and we went to that area to share our experience. Now, out of this 10 years of work in the eco-industrial development at that moment, it was very, very exciting for these countries to investigate into the possibility of work doing EID. Until today, the German GIZ is very much promoting eco-industrial park in various parts of the world. So how big should an eco-industrial park be, okay, as an option of doing EID? It is really a matter of the economy of scale, or it is a matter of how we can mimic the nature by having enough species inside the system. So a perfect industry mix is very important. All these are important parameters. However, as you can see in the smaller island, the industry can be defined in a very different way. Some are just backyard or on handicraft industry, some a little bit more light industry, but very few go into the heavy industry. And therefore the mix availability is different, and therefore the EID options are also very much different. So the scale can be a province, a city, etc. Like in Japan, they started with this 23, expanded to 27 eco-town done by Rene van Verkel back 10 years ago in his documentation. When we were meeting in the Gordon, we have three approaches. One is called the top-down approach. It's very much policy-driven, and they are well-planned. This refers to Russia, China, and many parts of Southeast Asia, wherein they invite investors into the country. And that kind of approach is very much top-down, while the bottom-up approach is mostly carried out in the United States, especially led by our colleague Marian Chato from Yale. And we talk about what should be the minimum elements to be called an industrial symbiosis. And we created, if you can see me in my webcam, we created this logo, meaning that there are three companies with two flows of resources, 3 + 2. And that would be, can be coined as an industrial symbiosis option or initiative. And also in the Gordon Research Conference, Brad Allenby that time and Tom Gradle, we talk about, can we expedite the process? And we said maybe a sideway in rather than bottom up or top down. So we will involve expert or specialists to support the activity so that it can be expedited. So therefore, by doing that, I came back to Asia and looked at the entire Pacific, seeing that there are majorly three clusters of eco-industrial development approaches. One, I call them the East Asia and the Oceania, and I'm sure our first Anna would be very happy because I was quite worried after you have tried to term the area gods or lords after seeds, because it will affect the GEO report on seeds, because that is supposed to be a living document and seeds won't exist anymore after a few more years. But at that time, we do call Australasia and Oceania area. So I put here East Asia and Oceania covering China, Japan, Korea, and Australia. And in this area, about 50% are island economies. And these areas are more in advanced stage of development, and therefore the layout of macro and integrated resource management program are in place, and they are very much advanced in developing sustainable technology, or we call it environmentally sustainable technology for export oriented. So this is a self-generating economic model at that time, and that is very much synonymous to the circular economy concept nowadays in EU. Then the second cluster belongs to the South and Southeast Asia, wherein they are still firefighting in solving those problem on pollution, etc. In this area, 30% of the countries are more or less island economies, and therefore I developed a continuum framework approaches for them to adopt, which I will show you the next slide. And finally, the inland Asia and other seats, I have 2 minutes left, and other seats economies, and most of them, 90% are really Pacific small islands. And at that time, they are quite premature to the EID awareness and also application, because as I said, due to economy of scales and also due to the matching or industry availability for matching. Well, I developed a 4-stage, step-by-step on how to evolve from a single factory cleaner production to an entire eco-industrial park connection options. And this was discussed in details in one of the UN manual, which you can download. And it was done by me exactly 20 years ago. Now, there are detailed programs that I explained here. As I mentioned, economy scale and provision of the industry mix can be a great challenge or barrier to the EID development. I will spend the next 1 minute on the second part, which is the GEO seeds. As I mentioned, that we cover the Mediterranean as well as the Pacific, because this is a global report, and there are many stress on these small island states covering climate change on migration, not only on the fish and marine, but also on human migration. And there is a big issue about what if sea level go up, cover the entire island? Who will be the owner of the land that was originally at the spot of the middle of the ocean? And how will be their inheritance? Okay, future generation claim those rights. Those are many legal issues that we were discussing. And about the, of course, the rainfall pattern, the cyclone was also mentioned, and you could see the island of Taiwan case this year that they almost get down to 2% water reservoir, and luckily rain came only 10 days ago. Of course, we have all the data, and this appear in the SEEDS report. It's a living document, so once the new data are uploaded, and then you will see the graph changing. It's just like looking at the book of Harry Potter. And of course, we make a very good description of the natural resources and the stress also on those things, covering marine area, the status of the marine ecosystem, the shortage or access to the fresh water. The waste and pollution was well discussed by Dr. Wander a while ago, but we really focus on the e-waste and the non-degradable waste at that time, including marine plastic. We touch on the beach or the plastic washed on the beach and the plastic islands. Those were the cases. And the consumer goods and product were also a significant threat, because they do not have the right capability to choose, because most of them were given. And finally, on the energy choices, renewable energy resources, and of course, they encounter all these 4 big challenges: technical constraint, finance and investment, appropriate scales, and lack of enabling institutional framework. The last message I want to say is that for the Pacific Ocean island states, we believe that there is a need for innovation on small-scale smart technology, or a small-scale innovation is very important that will work effectively and efficiently at a small scale. So I will not be able to show you the others, because these are all the tables and the updates of all the policies available in. They are all available in the book of the GEO seats. Again, resilience, pandemic, economy of scale, proprietor, CMARC, and UNCRD 3R Forum Chair Summary that Heinz, Chantal, and I have been running for the last few years to read the chair summary contains all the Pacific Island reports every year over the last 10 years. Please visit their website and also get all the latest updates of them. And thank you for that. And maybe you would like to look at my energy studies. This is one of the latest publications. Thank you.
So thank you very much for these inspiring presentations. We would open the stage now for questions. Maybe anybody who has a question, want to ask or discuss something, raise your hand or write it in the chat. If there's anybody.
Dominic, I forgot.
All right, Paul, go ahead.
The question is for Amardeep. So I come from background in extended producer responsibility in British Columbia. We have 21 industry-led programs here. And I have been in the last couple of years speaking in the Caribbean, at the Caribbean Water and Wastewater Association conferences and introducing the subject of EPR and how it could work. And you hit a lot of points, which for small island developing states is that scale is the big issue. There's a lot of ambition to wanting to do things, but you can't just do EPR and talk EPR, because you got to think the whole thing through, from how you're going to collect the system, how you're going to engage the local residents in the system, the business people, the waste management system that might exist. And then most importantly is collecting it, and then what we call end fate of what's going to happen to it, if it's going to actually end up in a circular economy. And so small island developing nations in my last couple of years I find it a challenge, but I haven't given up in the conversations that I'm having in the Caribbean through the association. And things are doable, but I think it comes down to the will. And I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on, do you share that same sentiment in the Asia Pacific, as small countries, whether the will is really there at the high governance structures to make it happen? Because Australia, I feel, can play, New Zealand and other countries in the region can be the receiving end of these materials. And they do put a lot of investments into these island countries and in many different aspects. And I wanted to get your thoughts on, do you feel that that EPR can happen if higher level governance structures facilitated a harmonized approach on policy?
Well, thank you for that question. It's a topic I could go on for a long time. But interestingly, we've been working recently on the Plastic Waste Free Islands project with IUCN, and have done extensive comparisons between the Pacific and the Caribbean in various, in the waste management space and various things. And it's interesting you bring it up, especially for the Caribbean, because it seems to me that the Caribbean is actually more advanced in their thinking around EPR. For example, St. Lucia has had a CDL legislation written and drafted for the last 10 years, but they haven't been able to implement it because they don't have that political will to push through. And it also seems that a lot of this is being driven at the country level in the Caribbean. I'm not 100% hopeful, but I'm optimistic in the Pacific, in the sense that a lot of the work around EPR is being driven very much at the regional level, from the back end, thinking that, well, there is no solution that can be found for one country. So the way things have unfolded in the last 4 or 5 years, at least in the Pacific, has been that there was a big study that was done to look at what recyclable materials are being generated in which country, which is where the lack of consistency in data came through, and we realized that we can't say. Just it's impossible to tell because no one's ever collected that information. So in the last 4 years, there's been a consistent approach in collecting. That's when I wrote the methodology in collecting that data. And now we've come, by the end of June this year, we will have collected information consistently on how much recyclable material that we can put an EPR on is available in each country. And the next step is to look at a regional approach to see if there is a possibility of being able to get those economies of scale. However, that cannot happen without EPR. The legislative sort of platform to incentivize the recovery of material has to be there. We just know that, you know, there's people trying to do voluntary and economic sort of collection of material for a long time, but it hasn't worked. So the new, I guess it's not a new approach, but the approach now has been to try EPR programs in the attempt to collect as much material as possible, and then possibly have a regional approach. I don't know if it will work, but I'm hopeful. But I can't see, I find it very hard to imagine a country level success happening for, because, you know, even if you were to collect material, then where does it go? And how do you transport 1/4 of a container of PET bottles? Then it takes 1.5 years for you to collect a container of bottles, e-waste, because of the small quantities that are being collected. And then there is also the additional challenges of the technical ability for locals to be able to undertake this work, which actually does not, I think, exist in the Caribbean. They seem to be a lot more progressed in that space. So I guess my answer is I remain hopeful. And I think this is a slightly different approach that the regional Pacific has taken to the Caribbean. I know of the OECS project on marine litter, where a regional sort of, there's some thoughts to sort of regional conversations around looking at the sort of Caribbean islands as a region, as a whole. I don't know the status of that, and if there is any thinking of looking at a regional consolidation of material as a driving force for EPR programs. So I think that's what I'm trying to get at, is that in the Pacific, at least, we are trialing the regional consolidation as a driver for implementing EPR within the country. Also, the big difference between the Caribbean and the Pacific is that the local budgetary support just does not exist in the Pacific, which does exist in the Caribbean. The Caribbean countries are much more organized. They seem to have, every country has like a recycling and a waste and recycling kind of body within the country that is managing and looking after this space. They have budgets, they have money to work with, none of which exists in most Pacific Island countries. Which also, it's challenging, but it also provides an opportunity, I guess, in the sense that a lot of things haven't been tried. But I guess there's a lot of, in the Pacific, I will also say just one thing about the desire to implement something. The Pacific countries seem to have a fair bit of political will to implement something in the waste management space. Not all of them, not consistently, but it is there in some countries a lot more than others. You know, Palau has an environmental levy, and like I said, has the most successful CDL program functioning for the last 5 to 6 years, with a return rate of more than 97%. It's incredible. Whereas, you know, Tuvalu is doing really well as well. So we have some small successes, but we haven't looked at the waste management space in the Pacific for a long time. So I think my answer is yes, but hard, but it's difficult. I think it will take a long time.
Yeah. Just further on EPR, when you say EPR, is that the government instituting producers? Because you wouldn't have a lot of stuff is imported. So the definition of a producer would have to trickle it down to the importer essentially, or retailer. So are they taking that responsibility at that level? Is that what they're doing?
So that is exactly what we're looking at right now. The two governments that have introduced something, it is the government taking responsibility. Pacific Islands, except for Fiji and Samoa, and perhaps PNG and Timor, do not produce anything. So there is a big driver for sort of banning and levying certain commodities because they also promote local manufacture or substitution of products. For example, in Vanuatu, when the plastic ban happened, a lot of people went back to their traditional woven baskets and materials, which was a great job opportunity for, and mostly for women's groups. And the same thing happened in the nappies and sanitary space, where it's a local women's groups who are taking up all the product substitution because alternatives are not available. So there is that angle to a lot of the material as well. There's a lot of work being done by World Bank and other multilateral agencies on looking at the alternatives which are locally made. So not importing them, but locally made. So that's another driver for similar change to happen. So yeah, we don't look at producers, we don't look at Coke or someone, we're just looking at everything that's imported and who imports it.
Thank you, Amardeep. I see here Valentin Russell has raised his hand. Maybe you want to come forward and ask your question. You need to unmute yourself, please.
He is unmuted, but
we can't hear you.
I don't think you're on mute. No, you're not.
He has to type his
yeah,
question
alternatively, maybe you
chat.
can type your question in the chat, or maybe there's like a headphone attached to your laptop, and maybe that's causing the problem.
Either you have headphones which are causing the problem, or headphones could fix the problem. So either way.
Let's see.
No?
Yes, now it works.
Ah, okay. Nice. Yes, sorry. So I'm Valentin. I'm from Réunion Island, so in the Indian Ocean. So it's a French island, but it shares many similarities with seeds due to insularity, small, few available land. The biggest difference is that we get a lot of funds from the European Union and the French government. So, and I'm a PhD student at CIRAD, which is an organization there, and my field of research is specifically the link between food and energy in a trajectory of self-sufficiency, because here we have a huge political debate around self-sufficiency and a lot of political willingness to go towards sufficiency, but in practice it's very complicated. So I have several questions, one question for each panelist almost. So for Mr. Rui Jing, I have a question about the agrivoltaic system, the production of food under solar panels. We have such experiments here, but I was wondering if you have a bit more information on the loss of yield due to the fact that there is a part of the solar energy that is used by the solar panel. And also I've heard, I was talking with the people working on this here, and they told me that the range of vegetables you're able to grow under this system is a bit limited, especially you're restricted to leaf vegetables like lettuce, cabbage, etc., and everything which is more like fruit vegetables or root vegetables is a bit restricted. So maybe you have a bit more information about this. I would be very interested to hear. For Ana Gero, I have a question about your definition of resilience and the definition you used in your presentation. Is resilience only restricted to acute events, like events that only happens at a very specific time in a time frame, or can it also be linked with more chronic problems, like, for example, pressure from overpopulation or a slow depletion in resource, like deforestation or stuff like this? And for Amardeep Wonder, I have a question about the political debate. Maybe you have a bit more information about the political debate that maybe took place in your areas of study around the limitation of production of waste at the source, whereas the management of the waste, but without limiting the production of the waste at the very beginning. So we have this big debate here at the moment on the island, because there is a big project of installing an incinerator, and there is a big political debate about whether we should limit the production at the source, which is limiting the bans. I mean, banning plastic bottles, banning a lot of products, putting a lot of pressure on the industry, whereas accepting that all this waste is produced, and then we just need to deal with this waste by building highly, high cost plants like a big incinerator. So if you have a bit more information about the political debate and the arguments that you've heard. Thank you.
Okay, maybe we go with Rui first, as you were addressed first in these questions.
Okay, thank you for Valentine's question. I think you mentioned a quite interesting issue of the yield and the PV panels. And I think that really depends on what kind of vegetables you plant, and it really depends on the climate conditions of your island. Like our test field is in China, and we try a lot of vegetables, for example, the lettuce, and it shows that if the shading ratio is not over 25%, I guess, so the yield would not be significantly affected under the panel. And also, like when we design the PV layout, we have, like I say, the chatbot layout, not just the whole cover. It's like one empty place and then a PV panel, and then another empty place and PV panel. So it also allowed a lot of the sunlight directly go beneath the panel to the vegetables. And of course, if the vegetables require the direct sunlight, maybe it's not that suitable. But I think you can, like, planting one kind of vegetable which not direct require the sunlight beneath the panel, and then in the open space another kind of vegetables, and then it's like different kinds of vegetables, one in a row, another, and one in a row, like this kind of layout to utilize the sunlight as much as possible. And if you have a greenhouse, maybe, so the PV panels can be mounted on the rooftop of the greenhouse. And I saw a lot of products. It's more like a kind of glasses that, although you have some covers on the top of the glasses, it also can spread the sunlight quite evenly on the in the greenhouse, to make sure that each row of vegetables can share the same amount of sunlight. Yes, that's kind of design. So,
Okay.
and I also agree with you that if if some of the vegetables, they are kind of the root crops, it's more suitable. And I saw lots of plants in Europe. They grow the berries. I'm not sure exactly what kind of berries, but they plant the berries under the panels. It works quite well. And in China also, we plant the Chinese medicine herbs, and it also works quite well. So that really depends on the local species and also the local climate. And I hope the information is helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Rui. Maybe Anna, you would like to go next?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Valentine, for a great question. I guess the short answer is no. It's not just focused on the acute short-term shocks to a system. If you could indulge me in just looking at my framework, I'll just share it again, just because it's probably easier just to engage with that. So this is our research framework, how we sort of define and think about resilience in our Pacific research. So with the first side of on the left, it's focused at the community level. So we're really thinking about resilience in terms of people on the ground. We call it the last mile, you know, people that experience climate change on the ground, and thinking about community in terms of a group of people with diverse characteristics in one place. And so this second part, I think, tends to answer your question. So what is the disturbance we're thinking about to that community? We're thinking about both shocks, so acute shocks. It might be a tropical cyclone, a storm, a strong wind event, and that kind of thing. Or, like you mentioned, the longer term chronic stresses. So for example, it could be a drought and that kind of thing. So there's ongoing longer term stresses. And then we think about how that community is able to respond. What's its capacity to deal with this disturbance, whether it be an acute shock or a long-term stress. And that when we think about their capacity to respond, it's about their exposure, their sensitivity, and their adaptive capacity. And we added to the differed framework was quite a simple representation of this. We added adaptive capacity building blocks. So what that actually means in terms of community in the Pacific being able to respond and their adaptive capacity. So we added these building blocks down the bottom. The number 4 in the framework is about their reaction to the disturbance. Do they, from the bottom, do they collapse? Is it untenable that they continue to live there? I think one of the speakers mentioned, you know, when the seas start washing over the land, that's sort of a representation of collapse. Do they recover, but they're worse than before? And we've probably seen that in terms of building back buildings and infrastructure, but not considering climate change considerations. Did they bounce back, or do they bounce back better? And I think that language, bounce back better, is starting to become a bit more common in considering rebuilding, particularly the hard infrastructure in the Pacific, ensuring that climate change considerations are included in that. Or do they transform? And an example of transform might be if a climate event, say a severe tropical cyclone, washed a bridge away that crosses a river, instead of just rebuilding that bridge in that same place with stronger, more climate resilient materials, perhaps it's considering perhaps that bridge isn't the best spot for it in the first place. Maybe they need to move the bridge further inland and plant mangroves to better stabilize the riverbank. That might be an example. It was a very simple representation of what transformation could look like. And then the number 5 is what I described in my my brief talk, so I won't go into that now. But I guess in short, yeah, when we think about resilience, it is both those short-term shocks and the longer-term stresses.
Okay, thank you, Anna. Maybe Amadip, you want to go next? She's still here.
Thank you, Valentine, for your question. In terms of waste to energy versus the top of the waste hierarchy, which we call reduce, where is reducing the use of material. The debate is raging in the Pacific about what's the way to go forward. The biggest, I guess, debating point is the fact that do the Pacific Islands have enough material to make a waste to energy plant financially or even in any way sustainable. So as multiple speakers have mentioned, the economies of scale just do not exist in the Pacific Islands, at least. There are a few examples of incinerators being in country which are not being used because they just don't have enough material to incinerate. Incinerators, just not waste to energy facilities, but incinerators do exist for quarantine waste and hospital waste in the Pacific Island countries. And already there are challenges of them not being serviced, not working, not even having enough diesel sometimes to be able to run them. It is actually the use of technology that is a bit of a challenge for a lot of these countries. If I was to take a guess based on the way a lot of the legislative process is going in most of the Pacific Island countries, I would say that we will see a lot of the single-use plastics phased out in the next 10 to 15 years. The biggest challenge that will remain will be larger materials like renewable energy, cars, electronics, because people keep getting richer and wanting to e-waste, as well as disaster waste. The debate still exists, and one of the biggest reasons for the debate existing is that there is a lot of commercial pressure and a lot of offers that the countries get for waste to energy plants or trials for waste to energy plants, but there are none, at least at the moment, in the Pacific. It is my understanding that there are a couple of Caribbean countries that have purchased a few pyrolysis machines. So we will be watching with great interest to see if they are actually successful in being able to use them sustainably, because there's the issue of legacy waste. There's a lot of waste at the moment that needs to be put through something. What happens after that? Because they generate a very small quantity of waste. So unfortunately, I tried, but I couldn't really find what the population of your island is to give you a better idea of how it would work on your island. So I think it does depend very much on the quantity of waste that is being generated by the country or the island. And that usually is a deciding factor of its success.
Okay, thank you, Amardeep. And thank you for this interesting discussion and questions. I think Simran wants to ask a question to Professor Chiu, if I'm correct.
Yes.
Please go ahead.
Thanks, Dominic. Thank you, Dr. Chu, and I am quite familiar with eco-industrial parks and eco-industrial development, and I was wondering what kind of opportunity might exist for, let's say, developing small island nations to pursue an eco-industrial development strategy, perhaps, given that it does heavily rely on, I suppose, localized manufacturing capabilities to be able to sort of, get into industrial symbiosis exchanges or eco-industrial parks development. And some of the Pacific Island state examples that we saw today may not really have those sort of capabilities when it comes to, having a strong manufacturing base to begin with. Anything in your experience that you may want to share?
Thank you for asking. Simran, actually, I don't mind to be quiet. In fact, I can be more relaxing. Thank you for asking. Okay, for the Pacific Islands, specifically on the small islands, I think we will not be using the term eco-industrial park. In general, we use the term eco-industrial development because eco-industrial development can take several approaches, and eco-industrial park is only one of them. It can be applied to a small unit, as small as a village. Like, for example, we have some UNIDO projects in the ancient city of Hoi An in Vietnam. So it can be to a small village. What we need to bear in mind is that it should be of a system approach, so that you have the general influx or the input, then in process and the output. And then we close the loop as much as possible. So I think those are the four basic units. Again, it's the input, the throughput, the output, and the roundput. So if we can close the loop as much as possible, I think that is some kind of a basic optimization, or we call it among the system engineering, we call it the near optimal as much as possible. And I have heard that many of us are practicing that already. From the input side, there are many areas that we can take into consideration. That includes energy, water, and materials. So these are mainly the three major resources. Material includes food and others. Now, if it is a locally or domestic facility that is processing these materials, then the early concept of cleaner production should prevail, because that approach can reduce to the minimum of waste that is generated or unused product that is generated. Industrial symbiosis, wherein the idea of making use of some waste coming out or unused resources coming out of one industry as an input to another industry, takes the assumption that the provider of those waste, okay, has already done their optimization part. Okay, they are not just generating the waste in order to be used by another industry. Of course, we can have a maxima, or we call it a macro and optimization, but we will look at a smaller scale in the Pacific Island. I think we try to minimize at the local level first. Now, on the imported goods that comes into the system, now we use another interesting tool of the industrial ecology called the material flow accounting. Now, for these imported goods, I also heard from the two colleagues, they already mentioned about choice editing. Choice editing is a consumption relevant tool, very powerful, used currently in big economies such as big supermarket, because they will only sell the product that are greener than other brands or other equal utility function goods. So if they have the choice, they will select the product that is of better or eco-label, so that the customer have no choice but to choose the greener product. Now, in island states of Pacific, if the government or the local business collectively have a strong voice, it depends again on the business framework called the 5 forces of Michael Porter. If the buyer has the negotiating power, then they can do the choice editing. But if the buyer has very weak negotiating power, then they cannot do it. Now, what does it help? A government or a local island economy may focus on a certain strength, since they cannot achieve economy of scale for all kinds of products. So they may like doing ecotown in Japan. Each ecotown focus on certain strength. Some have weak strength in dealing with plastic waste. So pet bottle management. Some have a stronger capacity to treat fluorescent waste. So this can be an equal strategy of some island states. They may identify, according to the Pareto analysis, what are the strengths of facilities that they can set up to manage the end of the life of these imported goods. And from there, they decide what are the products that they will import or not. Otherwise, they will reinvent the wheel by looking at indigenous resources that are more organic in nature, because at the end of the life, it is easier to manage. Now, the biggest threat today is not just plastic. Plastic is dreadful because they are big in volume, but the toxic material, including the e-waste, is very, very dangerous. And if there is not enough capacity to dismantle or disassemble this product at the local level, they are exposing the local worker to even bigger human health issue. So again, coming back in conclusion, for me, you can come up with a scale that will work, that has enough material flow to support a input, throughput, output, and a round put approach. And that will be okay as long as you keep at that level for the meantime. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I would hand the word over to Simran, as there is not much time anymore left for this session.
Sure, thank you. As usual, we are short on time, but I think it's been quite an insightful discussion. We did have one question in the chat from Sabrish, but maybe it can be something to reflect upon. Don't want to take up more of the time of all of you here, but I think the question was around to Anna and Amardeep around the role that Australia could play in Pacific Island nations' capacity development and technology upscaling when it comes to building resource self-sufficiency. And I think there's some recent development in Australia which might be relevant as well. So perhaps, maybe we can take this chat offline. But I just wanted to really have a sort of a heartfelt gratitude to all of you for making it today and for contributing so much of your own experience and insights. It didn't, and I think it ended up being more of a intimate discussion, which maybe is better at some times. And I'm sure that the community, which is part of the island section, would sort of benefit quite a bit from this discussion, as we'll make it available later on to them. But before we all go off to our morning, evening, afternoon routines, can I please request us to have maybe a photo? Yeah, sure, Amardeep.
Simran, sorry, I couldn't find the raise your hand button on Zoom.
Neither could I. I think it's disabled for co-hosts.
No. It's under the reactions section now. It's been in the update of Zoom. Yeah, it confused me for 2 weeks straight, but yeah.
But I was wondering, I know we don't have time, but are we able to submit some questions to some of the speakers? Because I have like a list of questions for the other speakers and I didn't want to interrupt discussions. So can I just start talking to people directly or?
Oh, yeah. I mean, yeah. What do all of you, like Anna, Professor Chu, Rui, are you happy with sort of some kind of follow-up discussions that may happen maybe over email or, another Zoom call perhaps?
Absolutely. Yeah. Happy for that. Yeah.
Okay, sure. That's wonderful. Thank you to all the panelists. If any of you have any questions for the panelists, I would be happy to link you up with them or share their email IDs if you would like to continue the discussion. Thanks, Amardeep, for raising that point. Great. So can we have a nice photo of all of us here today as one of our first events of the section? It would be wonderful for us to capture this moment. I'll try and take a screenshot. Thank you. Maybe another one. That's wonderful. Thanks so much, all of you, and have a lovely rest of your day, evening. And yes, I'll catch up with you in other forums. Thank you so much. And thanks so much, Bob, all of you, for making it. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Evening.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone. Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Oh, Dominic has left the call.
Yeah. He's probably going back to sleep. That's what I would do.
Maybe we can just I'll ask him if he can come online just for 5 minutes, maybe to have a wrap up.
Yeah.
Do you have to go for any other?
Just give me 1 second. I'm going to stop the recording.